Well, hello and welcome to today's episode of Breaking the Taboo. And I'm absolutely delighted to have with us a special guest today, who is Lucy Jones, an award-winning journalist and the author of 4 books, including most recently Matrescence on the metamorphosis of pregnancy, childbirth and motherhood, which was longlisted last year for the inaugural Women's Prize for Non-Fiction. She's also written for many other people, including The Sunday Times, The Guardian, GQ, and The New Statesman. And her first book, Foxes Unearthed, was longlisted for the Wayne White Prize. Well, Lucy, I'm so delighted that you're on the show today. And let me just show listeners, firstly, your fantastic book, which I read last year. And firstly, I'd actually never come across the term matrescence, but I found it so useful to hear that there was a term for this, critical moment, this transition in your life when you become a new mum. And for listeners who haven't read the book, Lucy is very frank about her personal experiences, and we'll get on a bit later in the episode talking about the kind of mental and physical health sides of childbirth and a bit about society's expectations. But I think the first thing that struck me, Lucy, reading your book was it was quite unlike other books I'd read on motherhood, because I think they all tend to be, if you go into a bookshop, you'll find lots of books on, hypnobirthing or pregnancy or how to have a home birth. There wasn't as many books which were a kind of more frank, realistic description of what it's like to be a new mother, both with complications post-birth and kind of how to deal with society's expectations of what a mother should be like. So firstly, welcome onto the show. And perhaps we could start there with what matrescence is. What does it mean and why do you think it's a useful term?
Thanks for having me, Theo. It's great to be here. And I'm so glad you're doing this podcast. And it's wonderful to be invited on. So the word matrescence is actually a relatively old word that was coined in the 1970s, but has been kind of re-emerging as an important concept in recent years. So it means, quite simply, the process of becoming a mother. So it's a word a bit like adolescence. And it was coined originally by the late American anthropologist Dana Raphael, who noticed that in most societies and cultures across the world, there is this acknowledgement and sense of a newborn mother. A baby is born and a mother is born also, and that becoming a mother, the period of matrescence, is a pretty big deal. And when I read that word, I was about 9 months postpartum. I had quite a shocking experience of birth and early motherhood. I was quite bewildered. My baby was spectacular, as all babies are, but I was quite blindsided by the kind of roller coaster of emotions and from the kind of isolation to the kind of terror of this huge love to the kind of memories of birth and so on. And I, for a long time, felt that there was something quite wrong with me. I'd absorbed these, depictions of the maternal ideal and this idea that you have to kind of enjoy every minute and it's the best thing that's ever happened to you. And, she was much longed for and there was a lot of joy and deep contentment, but there was also postnatal depression, and there was a lot of shock. So when I read this word matrescence in an article in the New York Times by Alexandra Sachs, my shoulders kind of dropped for the first time. And I think it's such a transformative and important concept because it gives us a word and a way of paying attention to this period in a woman's life, which can be very vulnerable for different reasons, and is a process which the science of motherhood is kind of illuminating more and more every day. So that's quite simply what it means.
That's so helpful. And it's so helpful to have a term to describe it because, becoming a mother is such an important transition moment in your life. And, I've just had my first baby and I really wasn't prepared, to be honest, for how huge a lifestyle change it is. And sometimes I think particularly in the Western world, we might be, living on our own or in much more sort of individual, insular lives. We're not living necessarily in a village or, in a tribe as they used to live back in other countries. So we've kind of lost our support networks in a way, and we're trying to do it on our own in many cases, which has made it very difficult. So can we just go back to sort of the beginning of the pregnancy journey? Because I'm very interested to know kind of what support and information is out there for new mothers. And what struck me reading your book was actually the lack of information, Lucy, that you didn't feel that you were prepared for your birth and for what happened to you. So could we talk a bit about that? Because we've talked on previous episodes about the importance of antenatal education. We've done an episode with dads actually where they've talked about, what they should discuss with their partner ahead of birth. But I think we maybe don't have enough of an honest conversation with mothers about risks in childbirth and what could go wrong. So what did you know and what did you find helpful?
Right. So for a bit of context, I have 3 children. So I think there are 2 kind of births which are more relevant and one birth which resulted in a birth injury, which I can talk about. But I guess one of the, in all 3 of those experiences, even though I had, experienced birth for the second and the third, my experience was that I was absorbing a lot of information about how to have a painless, scare quotes, natural birth. And the stuff that I was listening to, which is actually very famous, kind of renowned hypnobirthing, what I absorbed from that was that if I did my hypnobirthing exercises and I was calm, then I could manage the pain of the birth, and there was just so many moments in this childbirth experience which were so shocking in the moment because they were so different to what I had felt and the information that given to me. So, for example, my first labour kicked off on a Saturday evening, and I thought labour could be like 12 hours maybe, or like, my mum went into labour with me about that time and I was born the next morning at 7 a.m. and I thought, okay, I'm going into labour on Saturday night, she'll be here tomorrow at some point. And I went into labour and immediately the contractions were very strong and very regular, but not regular enough, to call the hospital, the 3 and 10, I think it was. This was in 2016, 3 contractions in 10 minutes. But essentially, I was in labour for, I think, 46 hours, regularly contracting. So I wasn't getting any sleep. I went into the hospital the next day, had to come back because I was only 2 centimetres dilated. Eventually she was born on the Monday, late afternoon. But that was, that in itself was quite a shock because I lost 2 nights of sleep. I went into the kind of, active labour, even though it was all very painful for me, like physically depleted, like I'd kind of never been, like I'd been awake for, 3 days. And then, the birth itself was for me one of a lot of fear and kind of surprising levels of pain. And I wasn't diagnosed with PTSD, I was diagnosed with postnatal depression, but looking back, I was very, very hypervigilant and anxious in the months after. And there was a moment in the birth where, I thought surely she was going to die and I was going to die. So there's almost no words to describe that experience. But I think probably the experience that's maybe more relevant for us today is my third birth, which ended with a birth injury. So in terms of the absence of information, And I'm kind of like a bit, ashamed to kind of say this. I feel a bit kind of naive or ignorant, but I went into my third birth. I had no idea about birth injuries. I kind of knew I had had a second degree tear with my daughter, and I'd heard kind of horror stories from like my brother's friends about how you can like, rip all the way through, and we'd kind of like thought, oh, that would never happen to me, or I was so shocked when it happened to me, and I looked into the statistics at actually how, I mean, not common, but it's not uncommon. What is it, 6% of the of first time? I mean, there's a lot of women walking around with birth injuries. Anyway, that baby was born at home, and he was very big and he was very late, and his arm seemed to be over his head and kind of tore. I had a 3B tear, and I had to go to the hospital for a repair afterwards. I mean, it's actually quite hard talking about it because it was so frightening, and in a way, it was the aftercare, or the lack of aftercare, that compounded the whole experience, and the sense of thinking no one seems to really know how to recover from this injury. Maybe we'll go on to this later, but I've had kind of years under colorectal department in the local hospital, and I'm definitely much better than where I was, but he's nearly 4 now, and it's been a really kind of strange and confusing time for my body. I don't know whether I wouldn't have been able to take in information about the risks of birth injuries, but I do feel like the absence of information is manipulative, and it is doing women a disservice, and that when a birth injury happens, the lack of information, particularly around kind of postnatal care, it's not fit for purpose. It's inadequate.
Yeah, well, that's something that we've talked about many times on the show is, firstly, we should trust women and we should give them the information that they need. And one of the reasons that I set up this podcast was to break the taboo by talking about it, because I was so surprised to see the shame and the stigma that women associated with talking about difficult childbirth. And I think something I really want to tell listeners today is, if you've had birth trauma, it's something that's happened to you, not because of you. And there is absolutely help out there. And firstly, Lucy, I'm so sorry to hear about your experience. And I'm interested that it was your third baby, but you still were very surprised that you had a birth injury. So firstly, just on this point about taboos, I mean, it's something you researched a lot in the book, and obviously you spoke to so many women whilst writing Matrescence. But why do you think it is that women don't feel that they can share if something has gone wrong and if they have suffered birth complications?
I think there are probably a lot of different reasons for it. I think that there isn't the kind of space for it in our society. So, everyone is very focused on the baby, and it's almost like when a baby is born in our culture and society, the mother gets kind of forgotten and kind of pushed to the side, and we just want to focus on the baby. You can see that in the kind of baby-friendly hospitals, which I've always thought were a bit strange, because I mean, where's the mother in all that? I mean, obviously we want to be friendly towards babies, and babies are our most vulnerable and need so much care. But I think there is a kind of denigration and a disavowal of what women go through in birth, and particularly if there's birth trauma and birth injuries. So I think there's just this kind of societal denial of the realities of childbirth, and a kind of maybe instinctive wanting to kind of look away from it. But I'm certain we can evolve past that, and that we can break the taboos as you're doing, and that we can find language and find the strength to be able to talk about these things and to not kind of react just in a kind of squeamish way or turn our heads. But I think also that the reason for that is the simple lack of information. I'm really glad that when I had my tear, that the OAC care bundle had come through, and there was a leaflet that I pored over and read, and trying to understand, what had happened to me, how was I going to recover from this, And I interviewed Rani Thakar for my book, and her and her husband have done huge work, in increasing repairs and being able to actually kind of diagnose injuries and so on. And obviously I was lucky that it was noticed by a midwife then and there, and I was taken to theatre really promptly. But my sense is that even within the healthcare system, like I found it with the midwives that I was attended to in the weeks after, they almost didn't really know about birth injuries. Like it felt even outside their remit of understanding. Like I remember one of them, I put it in the book, said something like she'd heard that some women were using this spray on their tears and it was causing infections, and she kind of rolled her eyes about it as if the women themselves were kind of being silly. And I just remember lying there in bed. I was in bed for about, I don't know, a month or so. I couldn't walk for a long time. And I just remember thinking, I don't think this person has been trained in birth injuries, or actually what it's the lived experience of women after birth with trauma injuries is. So I think we're at the beginning of a lot of change that needs to happen in order for women to be able to talk about what's happened to them and how it affects them and what they need, and be able to advocate for themselves. So I have basically 2 prolapses, which are one's definitely related to the tear, but they're kind of quite random. Like it took years for them to be properly kind of diagnosed what was actually going on, and the whole area for me just felt very like, I don't even know what's happening down there, or the language. It's very confusing to, and I think we just need more research, more investment, and that will help break the taboos as well.
I totally agree with everything you're saying there, Lucy. And sorry, just for listeners who are not aware, some of the things Lucy's referenced, the OAC Care Bundle is the obstetric anal sphincter injury package, which has been rolled out in some UK hospitals and NHS trusts to do things to reduce the risk of birth injuries. So one of the things I campaigned on as a former MP in Parliament was to get that training rolled out to all hospitals, not just in certain areas of the country where they have that service. So I'm pleased to hear, Lucy, that you did get the leaflet. It's really important that mothers do get access to specialist care after having these experiences. And I think what also struck me reading your book was the very different approach to motherhood in different cultures. So I mentioned in my introduction there about, living in the UK is a very specific context, but I've spent a lot of time in the developing world, particularly in Africa. And actually some of the societies that I visited treat motherhood in a very different way, where there's a huge amount of support from your community and local society. And, really the mother, everyone kind of piles in to help. It's not the situation like I had where I live, several hours away from, immediate members of my family. My husband's at work all day. And you're basically left on your own with a newborn baby. And you talked, I thought, very movingly about the loneliness that you felt as a mother in that scenario. So firstly, what did you learn when you started researching other cultures? And are any there lessons there for the UK about how we can better support mothers in that kind of postpartum period?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one of the things that kept coming into my mind in those early months when, like most new mothers, I was spending, I think it's 80% of the day without adults. I think that's the kind of statistic that new mothers spend alone, which is, considering we're social beings, clearly not ideal. I just kept thinking, like, my nervous system doesn't feel like evolved for this. Like, I'm not sleeping. I can barely go to the loo. I can't really feed myself. Like, this feels a little crazy, and so I thought, what are my ancestors doing? Like, how did they raise their babies? And, as you say, we do live in this, very kind of ahistorical, unusual, individualistic society in the West. And, a couple of things really helped kind of liberate me from a lot of the shame I was feeling around struggling. And one was the evolutionary research, which just shows that for 99% of our history, we were collective cooperative breeders, and the way we are doing it today is a evolutionary mismatch. But then, as you say, looking at different cultures around the world, which treat giving birth and becoming a mother as a kind of emotional and physical traumatic crisis, and have the rites and the rituals to hold the mother, to help her to recover from childbirth. So there's all sorts in India, China, countries in South America and Africa. There are these different kind of rites and rituals. So often, and I'm sure you and your listeners will know about these kind of 40-day periods of kind of the fourth trimester, or the 40-day period where the mother is kind of cooked for and brought special soups and warming foods, and massaged and cared for, so she can kind of feed the baby and recover from the birth. But there is this kind of team of women who are caring for her as she recovers from the birth. And that is just so different from the way we do it in the kind of UK, Europe and US, where you're kind of out of hospital within a day. Your partner might have 2 weeks off, perhaps, might not, and then you're, as you say, kind of alone. And I think that we've forgotten how vulnerable this transition is, and how the early weeks and months of motherhood, and compounded if they are by trauma and birth injuries, are a time where the mother needs care and to be looked after as well. I mean, I suppose this is clashing with like the very notions of autonomy and freedom that our society is built on. I have massively benefited from those kind of ideas, but they clash so much with the dependence and vulnerability of this time. And I wonder if that partly fuels the taboo a little bit. We are told to bounce back and get our bodies back, and get back to work as quickly as possible. I'm sure there must be a kinder way.
Absolutely. Well, I agree with everything you just said there. And I think we do need to think as a society about, what support networks do we set up for mothers? And that's why I campaigned so strongly in the House of Commons to end the postcode lottery in care, because I didn't find it acceptable that, depending on where you live in the UK, you would get access to a different care pathway post having your baby, which obviously the government needs to do something to address. So just picking up on your points about birth injuries, Lucy, and you've been very brave to share openly what happened to you. And thank you for doing so, because I think it helps other women listening to the show to feel less alone. Back to your point about the kind of shame and the stigma that, we don't talk about this enough in society. And hopefully by me sharing my story, and you and others who've come on the podcast, it's helping women to know that, this has happened to other people too, and we did get help, and we have started to recover. So just on that point specifically, you mentioned that you had to go in for repair surgery. Are there any resources or things that helped you with recovering from your birth injury that you'd like to signpost listeners to?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think that, so much of what was helpful in those times was hearing other people's stories, and and realizing that you're not alone. So for me, I I got a lot from the birth tear support group on Facebook run by Rosie. So there's a group on Facebook. I think it's called BTS, Birth Tear Support. And I found that a really good place to ask questions and, to feel like I could kind of, in a really honest and frank way, try and understand what had happened, and what the recovery kind of was looking like, which is obviously different for everyone. I have to say that I felt really well looked after when I had my repair. In that moment, the doctors, the nurses at the hospital were very, very kind and compassionate. But I really struggled with getting any support from the midwifery team in my area afterwards. I was under the home birth team, and I kind of felt a bit like, honestly, a bit kind of like abandoned. Like I'd had this kind of bad ending, which, they're not going to put on their infographics on Instagram, which are kind of, pink and have flowers on them, and, saying that, there were no tears this month, which I get it, but there's something that where the violence of birth is disavowed in that. And I felt that there wasn't enough of a structure to provide the postnatal support I needed. So I have had a really good NHS physio. So she's been almost a bit like a kind of, she's not a therapist at all, but she's been great, and it's been really good to feel like, I could go and see someone and be able to talk about, going to the loo and all those difficulties. So that's been helpful. I found your piece really, and following your work and being kind of connected to other people is kind of profoundly important, I think, because it can, in a way, I can't really explain to like my friends or like what it feels like, or like I have an issue where basically the muscles are kind of really damaged, and it can feel very isolating, and also I think there can be lots of knock-on effects. So for example, I've recently started jogging a bit, but I couldn't run. I've always been a runner, for my mental health, and it affected that, and it can affect your confidence and how you feel about your body, and there's a lot wrapped up in these experiences, I think. So those were I guess also steadily starting to feel a bit better, and knowing that actually, there was a point where I thought, am I ever going to heal? Am I ever going to, it just felt so traumatic. But, it has actually taken me quite a long time to get to the point where I can like do a bit of a jog, almost 4 years. But I think trying to, be positive, that I hate toxic positivity, but, maybe my body is healing and all that kind of stuff. And, I have to really watch what I eat, and in terms of like fibre, and there's so many different things that have changed. And I think breaking the taboo and making it more possible to talk about these things kind of lightens the load a bit.
I totally agree. And thank you so much for your kind words about my campaign, Lucy. And what was so interesting to me was when I first shared my story as a politician about having a traumatic childbirth. To be honest, it didn't occur to me that, hundreds and thousands of women around the country would start sending me their stories, which is how we ultimately ended up having the birth trauma inquiry for the first time in the UK Parliament. But what was interesting reading the stories was how I assumed it'd be mothers who'd had birth very recently. And of course, we had many of those in the last few weeks or previous months, but also had mothers writing to me who'd had birth trauma decades before, and they felt they hadn't been able to talk about it to their partner, to immediate family, to colleagues. And I think that this was amazing, that it was the first time really that they felt they could start talking about it, and that finally we are having a frank national conversation, which I hope this podcast is continuing. So just thinking about the kind of inadequacy that a lot of mothers feel who've had a traumatic birth. I mean, I certainly had a lot of issues with breastfeeding, something we don't talk about enough. And other mothers have talked to me about issues of bonding with their baby and obviously not having the expectations met of what they'd planned for before the birth. So could you talk a bit about the challenges that you face with your newborn baby? And can we talk a bit about society's expectations and how mothers haven't failed if they are having difficulties? I think that's a really important point I want to get across today. That, you know, life is not a pass or fail test being a mum, and it is difficult, and, you know, it will get better. And Lucy and I have had, you know, challenges, but we've got through them. So could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think that there is something that really surprised me when my first child was born, was how much there is this kind of epidemic almost of kind of misinformation or kind of absence of information, or, well, taboo, of course, and kind of obfuscation maybe. And that for me really played out in feeding. So, you know, I had been told in my antenatal classes, just feed on demand. You won't make as much milk as the baby needs. Just feed all the time, and, you know, Bob's your uncle. And I basically couldn't seem to. My milk didn't really come in, and my baby would lost lots of weight and was jaundiced, and I was thinking, how is I basically got I was so devastated about it, because I thought I've failed my daughter at the first hurdle, that I can't give her this milk that she needs. And, you know, I ended up having to supplement the formula. But looking back on it, so I mixed fed all of my babies, and now I know that I have this kind of thing called hyperplasia, where I would never have been able to produce that much milk anyway. But, you know, who knew about that? You know, we don't get told about these things. But I, you know, mixed fed, formula, some breastfeeding, all of that, you know, it was fine. And looking back, I think that there's so much ideology comes into new motherhood, in the absence of actual evidence and information. So I think a lot of women do mixed feed. And as we know, like, I think it's 1% of women are breastfeeding at 6 weeks in. So this idea that, you know, we're all breastfeeding for 6 months or 2 years, it's a nonsense. And yes, we need to have, like, public areas, structures, systems, so women can breastfeed in public, and, you know, be supported to feed their babies as they want. But I think there's a lot of kind of misinformation and kind of fantasies around feeding, which feed into this kind of idea of the kind of, scare quotes, natural mother. And, you know, we have these expectations on us that, you know, it sometimes feels like, I remember being out with my newborn, and, you know, I'd try and breastfeed them in a cafe and feel like really embarrassed, because I felt like everyone was looking at me, and breastfeeding could be really difficult. And then I'd get out the bottle of formula and feel like incredibly ashamed, because I was doing this thing which was like, you know, scare quotes, poisoning her. And I just think it can be such a heady mix of all these kind of social rules and ideas, which, you know, for me, it took quite a long time to disentangle. And I'm there now. You know, I can kind of, I think, see where I feel like empowered to be confident in my decisions, and to be able to kind of smell the smoke of ideology. But I you know, one thing comes to mind, and I'll end on this. I know I'm blabbing on a bit, but I remember when I had my tear, my 3rd degree tear, I think I was about 5 or 6 days in. I was in bed, and, you know, I felt totally banjaxed and shocked by what had happened to my body. And a midwife called, and asked me to go into the hospital. I think it was because my baby was losing weight again, to go to a hospital which was like an hour away, instead of the one locally. And in that moment, having it being my third, I said, there's no way, I can't get into a car. I'm bleeding like very heavily and I can't walk. I'm not going to that hospital. But, you know, back then, if it was my first child and I was kind of didn't know anything, I would have gone, okay, they're telling me to do this, so I need to go to this hospital. And it probably would have, you know, I had a wound breakdown anyway. It probably would have, you know, created a wound breakdown. So I think the way we are with new mothers can be very cruel in terms of the lack of evidence and proper information without ideology.
I think that's a really important point. And part of the purpose of this podcast is to give mothers a chance to listen to other mothers who've had similar experiences and to feel not alone. But also that's why we have, you know, healthcare professionals coming on the podcast to talk about specific issues. So if anyone's listening who's got a birth injury, do check out our earlier episode with the Masick Foundation, who's a fantastic charity that really specialise in this. And they've given some really practical advice on living with those life-changing injuries. But likewise on maternal mental health, we've had in other groups and healthcare professionals, including psychiatrists, to sort of signpost mothers to where they can get help. And Lucy, you touched earlier on when you talked about your story about your mental health issues. Would you be happy to share with listeners, you know, some of the symptoms that you started exhibiting? You mentioned obviously, you know, hyperanxiety. That's something that we see with so many mums affected by birth trauma. So how did it manifest itself, and when did you realise you needed help?
Yeah, sure. So I think that in the first couple of months after giving birth, I was definitely experiencing like hypervigilance, and I was finding, I think my nervous system was just quite kind of in shock, basically. I was very anxious about the baby and kind of her breathing, and I was running over the birth in my head a lot. So I just couldn't kind of stop thinking about it in a way. And I was also incredibly sleep deprived. So she was the most wonderful baby who did cry quite a lot and had colic and was nocturnal, as many babies are. So as the sleep deprivation wore on, by about the third month, I felt that I'd had periods of depression in the past before, which I'd been treated for, and I just felt like my mood was kind of plummeting. So I went to the doctor and I had the Edinburgh depression scale and got diagnosed and responded quite quickly, thankfully, to antidepressants. And then I had a kind of another blip when I had to go back to work when she was 9 months. I found the kind of whole thing about childcare really difficult. I think it was, you know, my anxiety. She was very highly sensitive. It just felt so hard. And again, I had another kind of difficult time then. And, you know, looking back, I'm really, really grateful for kind of medicine, and I'm so glad that I seemed to respond well to that. But I also found, you know, therapy. I had therapy on the NHS, kind of postnatal CBT, basically, for kind of anxiety. But I think that a lot of the kind of, you know, I sometimes think about depression as like, it's like there's like a wound, and then it can tip into like an infection or like sepsis or something, and then it becomes something which needs to be treated in a different way. And yes, I'm susceptible. I've had it in the past, but I think there's something about caring for that wound in a kind of biopsychosocial way, which is worth thinking about. So, for example, and I'm coming at this with a lot of privilege, like a lot of social material privilege, a good marriage, great husband, great family. but still I found, things like getting on a train where there's nowhere for a buggy to go and having to like pack up your buggy when you have a newborn in your arms, that would just kind of wear my stress levels down. This kind of chronic hostility to mothers and babies that I think we have in our society, has a big part to play in improving maternal well-being as well. So I would say that if anyone's struggling in that way, there's help out there. There's, help at your doctors. There's pandas. There's lots of postnatal groups now, like writing groups some people can find that really helpful, particularly for kind of processing birth and trauma. And there's a real energy at the moment, I think, for women to create places and spaces where people can go and express their experience and be together and know that they're not alone. And I think we need that, and we also need the systemic structural change which you, Theo, have been working so hard to change as well.
Well, I absolutely agree with everything you just said there, Lucy. And I think a really important point you just made to mothers is that help is out there. And, I'm receiving every day messages on social media and emails in from mothers asking for help or sharing their stories. And firstly, I'd like you to know, if you're listening, that you're not alone. Lots of mothers have been through a similar experience. There are some really fantastic charities out there to support you. Lucy's just mentioned several, and I'll make sure we include in the show notes, several links to those organisations so that you can find them. So, Lucy, we're coming towards the end of the show. So 2 questions I always like to ask my guests. And the first is a really practical one. So what would be one piece of advice that you'd like to give families listening to the show today to know about, or something that you wish you'd known when you were pregnant that you didn't know at the time?
Yeah, well, I think that the concept of matrescence and patrescence, which is really a way of thinking about this transition and this metamorphosis of becoming parents, it can be a really kind of revolutionary and helpful framework, because it allows us to kind of conceptualize this time as a moment that is a process. So that meaning that there are, as we know now, because of this amazing kind of emerging science of the maternal and parental brain, seismic changes happening in pregnancy, birth, and early motherhood. So even more dramatic than the changes that take place in adolescence. And we all know that adolescents are kind of feel a bit strange and they need like special care, but when we think about becoming mothers, we just think women should just breeze into it because we've been doing it since the dawn of time. But actually, this is a seismic impact on the brain and the body for good reasons, to help us to care for our babies. But that also means that the brain is vulnerable to stress, and therefore the way that we are supporting or not supporting new mothers and giving them the health care that they need, the support they need, is a shame, a stain on our society. So I think that this concept of matrescence and patrescence is also helpful because it describes the metamorphosis in a way where it can be, I think it's quite kind of liberating and freeing, because it's not going to go on forever. You're going to get there, you're going to heal, you will recover, the baby will grow, and change and process is kind of a hallmark of our world. And it can feel kind of like such a shock at the beginning, but it's a process that one goes through, and it's actually meant, it is going to feel quite weird, but that you are going to get through it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what I loved about your book was that it's a transition. So as you said, it's not the rest of your life. It's just adjusting to a new period in your life. And, your children will grow up and you will start to recover and heal over time. So just finally on the government question, Lucy, what would you like to see the new Health Secretary and the Prime Minister doing to improve maternity care and postnatal care in this country?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And there's a lot, isn't there? I mean, I think like your work on ending the postcode lottery is just absolutely crucial. I would really like to see, in terms of, in the context of birth injuries, all midwives trained in perineal injuries in clinics, because I think there is just kind of a lack and dearth of knowledge around the actual kind of biological, physiological, psychological impact of that and what that means to have an OAC, an obstetric anal sphincter injury, and also investing similarly in kind of postnatal care, particularly for women with birth injuries. And then I think that the government should, as a priority, be looking at the inequalities in maternal mortality and infant mortality across racial lines. I think that has to be a priority. And, if we living in a country where black women are 4 times more likely to die than white women, that has to be addressed urgently.
Well, I think that's a really important point to make, that there's a fantastic charity called 5 Times More, and they work particularly with black mothers because we know that they are more likely to have an increased risk of something going wrong. So if you've not heard of that organisation, check them out. Their founder came and gave evidence to me at the Birth Trauma Inquiry in Parliament, and they do some really important work on tackling kind of racial inequalities in maternal health. And Lucy, just as your final question, as you are a writer on today's show, I've just written a memoir about my own birth trauma, and this book is partly your memoir too. For anyone who's listening to the show who's interested in writing, could you just talk a bit about the process of writing a memoir and how you went about, bringing up some quite difficult and traumatic memories for yourself and putting them down on the page?
Well, I think I've always used language and words to make sense of the world around me. So I wrote my birth story, the first one, the very long one, down when my daughter was about 3 months old. There was a financial kind of imperative for that. I needed to make some money, and I was writing it for a magazine. But I found it very cathartic, actually. And I know that won't be the same for other people who've experienced birth trauma, but I think it can be for some. That for me as a writer, being able to craft something out of an experience, even if it's been, frightening, is very therapeutic, very cathartic. And in terms of writing a memoir with young children, I did a lot of it on my iPhone notes, pushing a buggy around the park. And, for me, it felt like one of the most interesting experiences of my life. It was so many, like such a spectrum of emotions on every day, sometimes in the same hour. Like I found the kind of drama of early motherhood, kind of interesting from a kind of literary perspective. I felt like, where are all these stories in the books that I read at university, or how have we not, what childbirth or motherhood is seen as this kind of mundane, domestic, boring, not worthy of proper literary attention, and actually that's staggering because it's so interesting, I think, and there's so many questions inside it, and questions of power and politics and us as ecological social beings. And I think it's a really interesting avenue to think about our society today. So there's some really great groups out there. There's the New Mothers Writing Circle, I think that's in Glasgow. There's a fantastic person called Lizzie Humber in Exeter who runs quite a lot of creative groups. There's a Maternal Journal. There's all sorts. There's a brilliant one in Reading. It's just gone off the top of my head. My toddler was up a lot last night. He's not a toddler actually. He's only 4. I can't call him a toddler anymore. I think these are really increasing. So I really recommend writing to kind of process things. I don't know how I'd survive without it.
Well, I totally echo that. Having just written my story down as well for the book Breaking the Taboo, which was out in May, It was in some ways re-traumatizing to have to live back through the experience of what had happened to me. But on some level, I almost feel like I've kind of archived it now. And by getting it down, it's kind of downloaded it off my brain. So if you don't know those different groups that Lucy's just mentioned, do check those out, because you may find journaling a really helpful tool just to kind of get some of those thoughts downloaded onto the page. Well, Lucy, can I thank you so much for coming to talk to our guest today? Such a fascinating subject, matrescence, and I think we should all be adopting it as a new term in society and make it as normal as saying the word adolescence, to really recognise that motherhood is this huge transition and moment in people's lives, and society should recognise that and provide step-up support and resources to help families. So if you haven't read Lucy's brilliant book, do download it. Matrescence is absolutely fantastic read. I think you'll get a lot out of it in terms of some practical advice and just really fascinating history and background about motherhood and some of the people that Lucy references in the book. And if you've enjoyed today's show, please do rate us on Apple iTunes. We are delighted to be in the top 5 most listened to shows now in the UK in our health category. So please do share it with families, other mothers who are affected. We want to make sure we're reaching as many groups as possible to get the support that they need. So Lucy, thank you so much for coming on the show and for breaking the taboo by speaking about your birth trauma and your fantastic book, Matrescence. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. Such a pleasure to be here.